Good afternoon. And I want to start by asking a couple questions. Number one, who here would like to write simpler code? Raise your hand. Awesome, yes. We all want simpler code, right? Number two, who here would like to write code faster that also is higher quality? Raise your hand. Yes, definitely, obviously, right? And lastly, who here would like new technology that you adopt in your projects to be easy to adopt and easy to integrate? Raise your hand. Right, yes. So all those things, I would say, sum up Jetpack Compose for us at Monzo. And that's the end of the talk, guys. That's all you need to know. Obviously, I'm just kidding. I would imagine you guys want to learn a little bit more about why that is for us at Monzo. So I'm going to go ahead and spend the next 30 minutes telling you all about that, right? So number one thing at Monzo for us is, we are at a particular scale now that we really have to be very careful about what we decide to implement across our app. Just to kind of describe the scale of our app, we have a little over 200 feature modules, and we have about 17 Android developers across a bunch of different squads. So we're definitely not the biggest app in the game, but we're definitely not the smallest app, right? So kind of in the middle. I like to call us in the middle of like the Ubers and the Series Bs of the world. And so that's a little bit about Monzo, a little bit about me. My name is Ryan Simon. I'm a senior Android engineer at Monzo. And I've been using Compose now for about a year and a half since it was in alpha. And the last question I want to ask you guys before I get into the meat of this, who here has been using or has used Compose at work? Raise your hand. Okay, cool. So the first part of my talk, the first couple of minutes, may not completely apply to you guys, but for everybody who didn't raise their hand, it's gonna be great for you. I'm just gonna do a little refresher on Jetpack Compose, take a couple minutes, and then we'll go right into the meat of it, okay? So, of course, we're all here because Jetpack Compose is awesome, or at least it sounds awesome, right? So the first thing that makes it awesome, and you may have already heard this at some other talks today, is that it's declarative, right? What does that mean? Very, very short and sweet version of that is that all you're really doing when you write Jetpack Compose code is you are telling Compose what you want, right? Instead of the old way in the view system of explaining how and being very, very detailed about how the UI needs to show up to the user, declarative is all about the what. And I'll go into a little example in a bit about that in more detail. Of course, at this point, we're all using Kotlin probably, hopefully, and having our UI in Kotlin is really fantastic because we get to leverage all of the things that are great about Kotlin, but now with our UI code, right? Intentional state, I think this is a big one, especially for those that are more experienced in Android development that have probably run into some weird state issues in your own UI code. And I think what makes it great in Compose is that you do have to be very intentional about what is stateful and what is not stateful. And that comes up the obvious side effects, right? So instead of having these side effects be kind of hidden amongst your code base in your UI code, you do have to be very explicit about how side effects are going to impact the UI. So side effects, for those maybe who are not as familiar with the terminology, it's things like navigation, things like showing a snack bar or something like that, right? So those are a lot more obviously handled in Compose. And the last thing, right, that makes Compose awesome is that it is the recommended toolkit now. It is obviously officially supported by Google, and that makes it very interesting for us to look at. So before I get into this example, I just thought I would ask a question for those of you in the audience that like pancakes. How would you normally order pancakes at a restaurant? It's not a trick question, I promise. How about you? How would you order some pancakes at a restaurant? Sure, yeah. You might say, hey, I want a stack of pancakes, right? Right. So in the view system, it's not that simple. Um, you might be looking at this code and being like, wow, that's a lot of code for my stack of pancakes. And it is a lot of code because this is what we'd have to do, right? If we have a recycler view and we want to show our stack of pancakes and we want it to be a dynamic and we want to make sure that if we update our stack of pancakes and we add some and we remove some, we got to make sure that we're updating that dynamically. We have a diff callback and all that stuff. It's a lot of code. It's a lot of boilerplate. And there's also a lot of to-dos in here. I'm not even showing all the code because if I wanted to show all the code, I'd probably need like 3 slides, right? So it's pretty complicated. There's a lot going on here. And this is what I meant earlier about how imperative programming or imperative UI development is the explanation of the how, right? It's all of the things we need to tell the UI to do what it needs to do, right? So what is a stack of pancakes? And that's really what we're talking about, right? If we order from a restaurant a stack of pancakes, it's just that. It's very simple. We don't have to think about how it's being delivered to us, right? Because in the imperative way, it would be like basically telling the waiter, hey, I'm going to order this stack of pancakes off the menu. And in addition, when you bring it out, it needs to be on a plate. And I want to see, you know, the toppings on top. And it should be at a temperature of 90 degrees and should come with syrup. Like, we never have to say that, right? When we're declaring to our waiter that we want pancakes. And that's essentially what Compose does for us. It makes it very simple. We can say, you know what, here is my list of pancakes. It's got a topping on top. And this is what a pancake looks like. And that's it, right? Quite simple, quite elegant, very, very straightforward. And there's not too much going on here. There's very, very little boilerplate. And, you know, it looks really nice. And there's even room for me to show you what a pancake stack looks like, which is, you know, a nice bonus. Yeah, so that's just a little bit of Compose, just some basics. And so just to motivate this talk, you know, I had this question that I asked everybody at Monzo about how they've been using Compose and what they feel about it, right? So I gave them this question. Imagine if Compose was taken away from you, right? So we've been using it for about 1.5 years. So I got some really interesting answers. One answer I got was really, really funny. They would quit Android development completely. So I thought that was kind of a way to describe really just how Compose has impacted their development process. The other answer I got, which was really funny, was they would just switch to Flutter. So so if they had to go back to views and they still wanted to do Android development, they wanted to keep declarative UI, so they would just go to Flutter. So yeah, so I think that's just a nice way to think about, like, in terms of how it's impacted us at Monzo. It's really been a huge win for us. So to go into a little more detail about why we adopted Compose. First thing was, the first motivator for us was a new design system. So our designers had come up with a better, improved design system, and our developers were thinking about, okay, what's the best way for us to make this work with our app, right? And so we did consider going back, doing styles and all that stuff in the classic view system. And for those of you that are familiar with that, it's quite messy. It is pretty painful. And so this was one of our major motivators. Then the other thing was just simplifying the reusability of our UI, right? So if you have looked at Compose at all, you would notice that because it's function-based, because it's very, very simple the way it's set up, it's very, very easy for us to build reusable components, right? And when you're creating a new design system, or you're trying to replicate a design system, you want your components to be very easy to reuse across your app, right? So this was very attractive to us. So we use Figma, and Figma for us, it's a great design tool. It's super friendly to developers because we get to inspect and see what everything is doing for us. And so we found that going from Figma to our Jetpack Compose code, especially because of how closely we could replicate the theming in Compose from the Figma styles and components, it really makes it quite simple for our developers to take a screen and just start mapping it into code, right? So that was another big win for us. Decoupling stateful code. So I already talked a little bit about this, but in general, just having the ability, right, to have a central source of truth for our state, for our UI, I think is super helpful in any app, right? And last thing I'll mention here is we just had great developer enthusiasm, and I think this is something in general that I've seen in Compose, right? Like I think a lot of Android developers that have had to deal with some of the pains of the view system, they're looking at Compose as a really great alternative. And for our developers, at least at Monzo, they really saw that and took to it pretty quickly. So I want to talk a little bit about the whole stateful, not stateful stuff. And I think this is, again, going back to, for those that maybe haven't been using Compose much, what does that look like, right? So for statefulness, all that really means in Compose is that a particular composable is doing something with state. It's remembering state, right? And then propagating that state to other composables. So in this example, very simple, we have a pancake screen, it brings in a view model, and we're collecting state, right? We have the state variable collecting state, and then we pass that state to the pancake content, okay? So this is what makes it stateful, is that it's actually observing the state, and then upon a change to that state, it's gonna rerun or recompose whatever content is affected by the state. So in this case, it's the pancake content. So pancake content ends up being actually quite simple. In this case, it's a when statement, so our state is sort of represented by a sealed class, pretty common approach to dealing with state. And in this case, there's error, loading success. So depending on what the state change was, we just output a particular composable to represent it, right? And so what's nice about this is that technically I could very easily reuse this pancake content in different places and not have to necessarily worry about who's keeping track of the state, right? So that's a pretty nice way, and this is sort of the recommendation from Google. They definitely recommend what's called here state hoisting, right? Where we have the state centralized and very easy to manage. So I want to talk about our migration strategy, right? So what did we do in order to make sure that all of our developers could use Compose, get onboarded to Compose, that we could start using it across the 200 plus feature modules that we have in the app? You know, there's quite a bit of code already that exists. So how did we do that? So number one, we took a look at Compose while it was in alpha. So this is a journey that we've been on since Compose was in alpha back in October 2020. And for our developers at Monzo, we felt like the alpha state was good enough for at least to start taking our design system and putting the components into Compose. Now, this is potentially controversial take, but for us at Monzo, we actually decided early on to not use the material design components at all. So instead of adopting material design completely in using the material theme that comes with the material library, we decided instead, because we have a very good foundational design system already, it didn't really make a lot of sense for us to try and Frankenstein the material theme with our design system. And this is something that I'll talk probably a little bit more later too, but this actually was super helpful for us because it did two things. Number one, it made it so that our designers could be incredibly flexible with the decisions that they decided to make with their components, with their color system and all those things. And second, because we didn't have to rely on the material theme components, when we decided to essentially copy paste, because we did do some copy pasting of some of the material components, when we pull in, let's say, our text button or what have you, we don't see duplicates of those coming up in the IDEs. So instead of seeing text button from Monzo and text button from material design, it's just text button from Monzo, right? So that was just helpful little boost in the dev experience. And then this is sort of an obvious one, I think, but we decided early on that Compose would be on all of our new work. So as soon as we had some of our foundational elements set up, Compose would be on any new features or any new UI that we were going to create. And we also decided early on that if we were going back to an existing screen and we were changing it significantly enough, we would just go ahead and refactor it into Compose. And one of the ways that we made this easier for ourselves, we used what we called the Compose fragment. Our navigation structure is very fragment and activity heavy. So our app was designed back in 2016, 2017. So, that was even before we were doing Java. We were doing it in Java. We were using a lot of activities and fragments. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to make sure that any Compose code we were adding to that existing architecture was going to be pretty easy to integrate with the navigation, right? So that's what we did with Compose fragment. And when you look actually at our Compose fragments, all the fragment is doing is calling set content and then putting the Compose in there. And then we have a couple extra utilities for logging and things like that happen in the Compose fragment base class, but that's it. And then the last piece of this in terms of getting adoption was demoing to team members, right? So even though 17 Android developers is relatively small compared to the Ubers of the world, right? That's still a good number of people that you need to convince that adopting this new tool is going to be good for them and good for the team and good for product development, all that kind of stuff. So the way that we did that, the way we got people to get on board and really get convinced was just regular demos, right? So that was super helpful. So I just want to cover real quick, because I think this is a really important aspect of getting Compose working, right, is how do you make Compose work with your existing UI? So the first thing, most obvious thing, is the view interop. And Google does a pretty good job of covering this in their documentation. For us, it actually has worked quite well in the few places that we've needed it. And what this has allowed us to do is take some of the themed components that we created in Compose and put them in some of our view layouts that we're still using today. And vice versa, there was, for example, a markdown library that we were using that is just a view library, and we haven't come across something in Compose yet that works for us. So we decided to just use the interop, put that into our Compose code, and it's worked really well for us. So I think that's something that every team needs to take a look at, right? And kind of see, like, how does this work for you? Are there any critical components that you absolutely need to make sure are working? I would definitely test those in Compose and make sure that that's working for you. And then integrating via fragments, I already mentioned, right? So we're using Compose fragment, and that's how we're getting all of our Compose code to show to users right now. It's all through fragments. And our Compose theme, we decided to keep separate from all of the existing UI in the app. So we do actually still use the classic theme system in the views, right? So any old screens that we had, we just decided we're going to keep that theme separate from the new Compose theme, and we're not going to try and merge the two, because technically you can do that. There is something in the documentation for Compose that allows you to reuse like your old view theme. We just decided to completely forego that because it was simpler for us to keep them separate. The funny side effect of this actually was that the Compose UI ended up looking better because of it than the old stuff. So there was a little bit of a downside there sometimes when kind of comparing like new to old, but in general it worked well for us. So in general, like what were the results of this adoption, right? How did it help us as an organization? How did it make us better developers? Those are the real questions that we would want to know, right, in terms of adopting a new tech. And so number one for us was speed. And this is something really hard to measure, I'll be honest. But what I can say is that our product managers took notice right away. So the feedback we got from product managers was that we were so fast that they started questioning what was going on with the iOS team. You know, because Compose was that good and it was that helpful for us to get features out fast. It was starting to show that the Android team was able to deliver a lot faster than iOS. And you know, that's probably in part because Swift UI is still really hard to adopt. So speed is amazing. And then I mentioned before, dev experience, you know, obviously really critical in adoption. And I think the dev experience for Compose overall has been really, really positive. I think there's been a little hiccup here and there with some of the IDE tooling, especially with previews, sometimes being broken, sometimes working between releases of Android Studio. But it's at a point now that it's very, very good and it's very useful. So I think the tooling has definitely caught up. And I think the last thing, honestly, that they hadn't done yet was profiling performance, and they're finally catching up with that. So the dev experience has been really great. And you know, I got to talk about animations, because if you've been working in Android long enough, you know that the view animation story is absolutely horrendous, right? And I think in Compose, they are finally fixing most of those things. I say most because I think there's still some room for improvement, and they know that, and they're improving on it. But what we found is that we've all been encouraged to do more animations in our Compose code, and because of that, that's improved the user experience, right? So, you know, we feel like we're able to put better user experience components into our app because animation is easier. So I think that's awesome. And last but not least, of course, is easier UI testing, right? So Monzo has a history with Espresso, and trying to get Espresso to work is quite painful if you've ever used it. And so because of Compose being functional, being declarative, it actually makes UI testing significantly easier, and I think actually quite reasonable, where before Espresso was just honestly miserable. So all really great reasons and great things that we saw because of our Compose adoption. So I think the general message here, right, is Compose reduces complexity, and it reduces complexity, I think, across the board, and that's what, you know, the huge net positive is of adopting it. And I do think that there's a few reasons why, at least for us, we saw that, and it really goes back to the strategy portion. I think without the strategy that we came up with, without sort of going slowly and surely in adopting and looking at what was going to work and what was not going to work for us, especially around material design and that kind of thing, I really do think it could have turned out differently. I think it could have turned out into a mess. And I have heard some stories about that happening. So it is really important to be strategic and to take your time with this, I think, like any other new tech adoption. That said, so what should you look out for, right? So what are some things that, you know, Compose maybe still is not perfect for, because no tool, right, is perfect. And the first thing I'm going to cover are some of the missing pieces that we found. And number one was material component parity. And this is something that we took care of ourselves. We just said, you know what, we'll just run it ourselves. We're going to do our own custom design system, forget about material components. But if you're maybe in a smaller team and material components is important to you because that's helping you increase your speed to delivery, right? This is something to look out for. They are catching up, like Material 3, they're behind on in terms of Compose, but they're catching up. So just something to look at, I think, when you're considering Compose. Drag and drop support. This is something that hasn't really come up for us at Monzo because a lot of what we do at Monzo is mostly just kind of showing data. It's sort of a lot of read data. There's a few places where we allow for reordering, but I believe we're still actually using the view system for that. So this is one of those limitations where it might come in. Auto-sizing text. Again, this is not something that was affected us, but it did come up when we were looking at this, and depending on your app, right, this might affect you. And these are things, by the way, I mentioned the roadmap there in parentheses, but these are all things actually that are on the Compose roadmap that they are working on fixing, and they're very much aware of it. So hopefully in the next couple of releases, we'll start to see these get taken care of. And the last thing I'll mention is type-safe navigation. And again, this also may be slightly controversial, but I really don't like the official Compose navigation. And the biggest reason is that it's not type safe, and it's string based, and it looks kind of janky, to be honest with you. It looks out of place when you compare it to the rest of Compose, right? And I think a lot of that, I have to give credit to Ian Lake and everybody who's on the navigation fragment side of things. Like, they did a really great job on making navigation work well in that traditional mechanism, right, of fragments. But trying to take that and Frankenstein it into Compose, I don't think has worked out. So there's some really great community options. So if you are thinking about using Compose for navigation, I think you want to look at some of the community options for now, and then maybe they'll fix that official one later. So a couple other things that to look out for. I said already a couple times, material just didn't work for us. It may not work for you, and I think it's important in general to look at what's there and look at your own design system and your own company's or team's capabilities and make a decision. Because to be honest with you, with Compose, it is super easy to roll your own theming. It's super simple. And the worst case is you just copy paste the open source material components and then build your own API on top of that. It is quite straightforward. So one thing to look out for. And then the Compose thought process. So there's a whole document in the official documentation about Compose, right? It's called Thinking in Compose. And you really do have to think differently, right, when you're working in Compose versus working in the imperative view system. And so this was something that caught some of our developers early on as just, it requires a different way of thinking, a different mindset, and you might be a little bit slower in Compose at the beginning because of it. So that's just something to consider. Another piece of feedback that I got from asking a few developers is that they wanted to try hacking some things and they couldn't. What I would say is that's a good thing, right? Is Compose really makes you have to think about your architecture, it makes you have to think about your side effects and how you're going to set up your UI. So I, in fact, think it forces you to be a better developer, but sometimes maybe that doesn't feel so great. So that's just one thing to think about. And then, of course, like any new tech, you got to sell management, right? So how do you sell your team, your management, that this is the right tool? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So how do you get your team to buy in, right? And the first thing, and I've mentioned this a couple times already, is Compose is a better dev experience. You don't have to take just my word for it or Monzo's word for it. There's quite a few case studies that Google has published on the official Android developers website. We also have our own case study that Google published in partnership with us, talking about how, a few more details about how Compose helped us out. And you'll see, I think, some studies from Twitter and a few other names you probably have heard of. So definitely take advantage of case studies. I think that's a great way to convince your team. The other thing is Compose, I think, even with some of the things I mentioned before about thinking in Compose and and all that stuff, it is quite straightforward, I think, to start learning Compose. It took me maybe a couple weeks of playing with it and using it and seeing how much easier it was to write a list, because that's beautiful. Writing lists is something that we all do, I think, quite commonly, and it's so much easier in Compose. So, just generally speaking, I think the learning curve is quite straightforward. And speaking of, the whole list thing, definitely just show examples, right? When you're talking with your teams, showing examples, demoing, all that kind of stuff is obviously going to be a great way to convince people that, hey, yeah, this does look a lot better than the view system. We should probably start using it. So then how do you get management to buy in, right? And I think the first thing that every business person loves to hear is productivity, right? It's that's their love language. So if we can say, hey, this is going to improve productivity, we have these case studies that show that companies have seen a measurable increase in productivity from their developers. I think that's awesome. That's a really great way to get their attention. Another thing that we've noticed at Monzo is that saying that we do Compose, that we've been building Compose, has actually been a way for us to attract talent, right? So it has been a way to get the attention of developers who have also seen the light with Compose and want to be working at a more progressive company that's embracing that, right? So for any company thinking about adopting a technology, I think sometimes one of the great side effects can be that it's going to be another way that you get the attention of candidates, right? And then the other thing is, I mentioned before how the design system is a lot easier for us in Compose, and that's really enabled better collaboration across design and development. And I also think that it's really opened the door with our product management. They've seen how much we can get done with Compose and how flexible we can be with this new design system. So it really has helped collaboration for us. And I think the other thing that business people love to hear is that it's a low risk investment, right? So the lower risk, the better. And for Compose, right, just like Kotlin was when you're adopting Kotlin, the Java app, you can really pick and choose the areas of your app that you want to try Compose in. So it's very low risk, it's low friction. You can kind of see how it's working. You can have a couple developers testing it out in silos and just kind of see how it goes. And if it doesn't work out, not a big deal, not a big investment. If it does work out, obviously great, right? So those are some examples of getting management to buy in. And I just want to leave you guys with just a little thing I was thinking about is, like, if everybody in this room adopted Compose, what would that look like, right? And for me, at least, I took a little bit of time to think about this, and really what this means is that we would just see better tooling in Compose, more great blog posts, more great resources, and kind of the theme of the talk is better productivity, better user experiences, just a better Android ecosystem. And I just think in general, Android would be better for it. So yeah, that's all I got. Q&A.